Welcome back to Daniele Terry's Italy. This episode is a terrifying foray into the life of a famous Italian composer, as well as a visit to a small hilltop village called Gesualdo. And we'll travel to Naples and Ferrara in northern Italy to learn about Carlo Gesualdo, who is one of the wealthiest princes of Renaissance Italy and a brilliant composer whose work was about 250 years ahead of his time. When he was rediscovered in the 20th century, Igor Stravinsky was so fascinated by his work that he made a pilgrimage to the village of Gesualdo. Now, this is an area east of Naples that's really not very well visited today, though it should be. But then in the 1950s, nobody was going to Irpinia. People were only leaving Irpinia to emigrate to the United States and Australia. To better understand Carlo Gesualdo's music, I'm going to introduce you to Michael Sirigliano II. He's a musician and the author of the Substack newsletter Shades of Blue, a place to cultivate calm, connection, and healing through melancholy moments of classical music. Michael is a beautiful writer, and I'm so excited to share with you our conversation, which is so full of insight and connections and things that just blew my mind. But first, we need to discuss why Carlo Gesualdo is not just famous, but infamous. It's because he committed a heinous double murder. And let me say right now that the details that I'm going to share are grisly. So if you have kids around or you're sensitive to these topics, please take some caution. Here we go. On the night of October 16th, 1590, in a palazzo near Piazza San Domenico Maggiore, Carlo Gesualdo killed his wife and her lover in their bed. If you listened to episode 4, Vittoria Colonna Had It All, you'll remember very, very well the church of San Domenico, and Gesualdo's wife was from the same family as Vittoria Colonna's husband, the Davalos family. It has also long been believed that the murder took place inside the palazzo where you'll find the San Severo Chapel. That's where people line up today to see the amazing sculpture of the Veiled Christ. The most reliable account of the murder comes from the investigators who inspected the scene the following morning. They entered the apartment and walked into the bedroom where they found the body of Don Fabrizio Carafa. Fabrizio lay on the bedroom floor wearing a woman's nightdress, with black silk ruffles at the collar and fringes at the bottom, and everything soaked in blood. The report describes his body as pierced with many wounds, including a gunshot that went straight from his elbow and continued into his chest, and the sleeve of the nightshirt was scorched, which indicates that the shot was fired at a very, very close range. Another gunshot had struck him in the head, and in the official words, a bit of the brain had oozed out. And then he had stab wounds on his head, face, neck, chest, stomach, kidneys, arms, hands, and shoulders. Beneath his body, there were a series of punctures in the floor, holes made by swords that had pierced all the way through his body into the boards beneath him. And on the bed lay the body of Gesualdo's wife, Maria Davalos. Her throat was cut and her nightshirt soaked in blood, and there were also deep wounds on her face, her arm, her hand, and torso. Witnesses saw Carlo Gesualdo. He was just 24 years old, and he entered the apartment with 3 other men, and he was shouting, "Kill that scoundrel along with this harlot. Shall a Gesualdo be made a cuckold?" Not long after, he came out. His hands were dripping in blood, but then he went back. He said, "I do not believe they are dead," and he did more violence. The official report ends with this line: Gesualdo has left town. He went to the village of Gesualdo in the area east of Naples known as Irpinia. Now, in the past 3 years, I have visited Gesualdo many times on the invitation of my friend Sarah Pompey, who hosts food and wine tours through her company, The Authentic Irpinia.
You see all these little hilltop towns dotting the different parts of Irpinia. And basically, what each one of those were the country estates for the nobility that had their palazzos back in Naples. And this whole area stretching from basically Caserta all the way down to Basilicata, was ruled by Carlo Gesualdo. He had his palazzo in Naples, and then he had his castle for his country estate was based in the city of Gesualdo. His different buddies, whether you were the Duke of so and so, the Marquis of this, or the Count, or the Earl, you would get land in Irpinia up in the mountains, and that's where you would go hunting. You had people that worked the land for you, growing your grapes for your wine, your different crops, tomatoes, pears, apples, potatoes, all of that was done out here in their country estates and then brought to them in Naples, or they would, come and spend their retreats here in the countryside.
Killing his cheating wife and her lover was not considered a crime, especially for somebody with as much political power as Gesualdo. But he did fear that the families of the slain lovers might come for him, and so he had all of the trees around the castle felled so that he could watch for his enemies. 3 years later, Gesualdo married again, and this time into the Court of Este in Ferrara. This was among the most important Renaissance courts, particularly for music, and he spent at least 2 years there where he wrote the first of his madrigals. Then he returned to southern Italy without his wife. Stories say he was abusive, shocking, I know. And for the rest of his short life, he was mostly in isolation in Gesualdo. He was able to just write music. He was super rich, so he was employing musicians and singers to live in the castle and perform music with him. And there are all sorts of terrifying tales of what he did there. One account says that he was, quote, afflicted by a vast horde of demons, which gave him no peace for many days on end, unless 10 or 12 young men, whom he kept specially for the purpose, were to beat him violently 3 times a day, during which operation he was wont to smile joyfully. There are centuries of storytelling about Carlo Gesualdo that include torture, witchcraft, and dark tales that inspired Werner Herzog to make an absolutely unhinged documentary in 1990. But the music, Carlo Gesualdo's music, is the reason he is still resonant, and maybe because he was just so far ahead of his time, that's also creepy.
Shades of Blue I started 2 years ago. It came out of basically my frustration with most people who write about classical music that you need to know about classical music because it's important or because it has this storied history. And to me, no one wakes up in the morning and says, I want to learn about something because it's important. My whole point was I listen to classical music I listen to because they bring me calm and they help me to feel connected. Much as I love looking at a painting, there's still always going to be that distance looking at a painting or a sculpture. Whereas music, it moves through you. There are sound waves that can change you on a cellular level when you listen to, certain types of music. It's why, sound baths are so important now. And so I like to think of melancholy moments of classical music as kind of being an equivalent of a sound bath. You sit down, you slow down. It's not just something that you're listening to in the background, but if you sit down, slow down, understand the stories, the very human stories that are behind this music, it's really creating powerful personal moments, but also connecting us to the larger ideas of awe and wonder in our lives and realizing that you don't necessarily have to go to a concert hall to hear this music. You can create kind of your own sanctuary in which you're connecting with these types of works.
I was on my way to Gesualdo because I have visited there. I have friends there, and I think that whole area of Italy, which is not very well known in the tourism world, it's called Irpinia, is really beautiful and has especially some of the best food and wine in all of Italy. I was driving through, it was at first playing Vivaldi's The Four Seasons.
Mhm.
And the rolling green hills and, that music, of course, gets you in the mood. And then I thought, well, I got Spotify. Let me put on Carlo Gesualdo and start listening to it. And some of it is beautiful. The polyphony is beautiful, but then some of it is just so weird. And I would say that, to your point earlier, I know that Carlo Gesualdo is important in the world of classical music. And I read this fantastic article in the New Yorker about him, but then I came to realize I don't really know what chromatic music is. I think I know what a madrigal is.
Weird is an absolute understatement when it comes to describing his music. People have called, I read someone called it nightmarish. Someone else said, and they work in anesthesiology. And he said, I work with pain every day and kind of the release of pain. And when I hear Gesualdo's music, I can hear pain manifested in musical sound.
Wow.
Another person Another person referred to it as kind of feeling like his music is, on a stretcher, and as you listen to it, it's kind of like this torture device that you could feel that's come from it. So his story is essentially kind of one of a kind in classical music, not just because of the music that he wrote, but because of the way his music is situated in this absolutely bizarre, by our standards today, life history. There are two things that are super interesting to me about Gesualdo's, and to most people about Gesualdo's music. One is the music itself, the music that he wrote. A ton of his music has not survived, so we have a very finite number of works of his. But you can absolutely hear kind of a disconnect in all the music that we have of his that he wrote after the murders of his first wife and her lover. Basically hear to me a degradation in his mental capacity, in his emotional capacity. So the first thing about why his music is interesting to people, and it's, you hit the nail on the head earlier with the chromaticism in his music, which was not, you rarely saw works like his back when he was writing, which was his published works are from 1595 to 1611. And what is chromaticism in music? So, what I always like to start with is we look at chromaticism, chroma, and chroma in Greek means color. So, when we talk about chromaticism in music, we are going off of the idea of what kind of extra colors are added to the music. So the wild thing is, Schoenberg was coming up with this at the beginning of the 20th century. Gesualdo was writing 250 years, 300 years before that. Gesualdo would use those five wild chromatic pitches in his music, but not only would he be using them and using them often, he would lean into them. So there are times where, he may start off one of his songs and it may sound like, oh, okay, my ear could tell that we're in one different type of key. And then all of a sudden, everything changes. And it's a destabilizing force. The reason why composers wrote using major and minor and keys and church modes for so long is we could hear conflict and we could hear resolution. But in Gesualdo, it's a lot of conflict and very few moments of resolution. So the things that Gesualdo was doing, we wouldn't necessarily hear again in the way that he was doing it until the second half of the 19th century, when composers like Wagner and Richard Strauss and Mahler were taking that idea of tonality that classical music was built on for 300 years and pushing it to its extremes, to the point where our ears don't necessarily know where home base is. He's leaning into that really crunchy dissonance.
And then Stravinsky becomes a great admirer of his. And one of the things you'll see if you visit the very small village of Gesualdo, which is today in the middle of nowhere, but you see pictures of Igor Stravinsky going to Gesualdo to make a pilgrimage to the castle.
Yeah, just Stravinsky was absolutely fascinated by Gesualdo, to the point where he hand copied out some of Gesualdo's madrigals. He would make what we'd say today is like a remix of some of those madrigals, and then he wrote a piece basically dedicated to Gesualdo that kind of puts Gesualdo's style through like the 20th century meat grinder. Yeah, in the late 19th and early 20th century, composers really got super interested in Gesualdo's music to the point where, as it stands now, if you look, Alex Ross at the New Yorker did this a couple weeks ago, but he went through and he's like, how many operas have been written about composers, a composer's life? And, Chopin has like two, Mozart has one. There have been 11 operas that have been written about Gesualdo's life. So
Really?
there
Wow.
is absolutely a point of fascination that people at large have with Gesualdo's, life and music when they hear about it, but composers especially. So he's like, we could use more operas about Beethoven and, Mahler. We don't need any more Gesualdo operas. Most of them are within maybe like the past 35 years. Contemporary opera is kind of hard to get on a larger platform as it is, but certainly contemporary opera about a man who was quite vile, led a very upsetting life, committed a double murder. I think it would be very, very difficult to try and pull off looking at that story from enough of a distance to get the merits and the bad side of his life.
We like an anti-hero, but yeah, he's double murder. And as grisly as it was, he's definitely a Tony Soprano. He had a lot of land that he lorded over, quite literally. And of course, there's the famous Palazzo in center of Naples. And Naples was such an important center for classical music and would only become more so. I mean, Naples and Vienna and Paris were among the most important places later on, certainly during the period of Mozart. But so much of the time that he spent was in Gesualdo, really in solitude, as opposed to somebody like Monteverdi, who's in Venice, who's in Florence. Gesualdo visited the Court of Este. He does move around Italy, but it seems from my research that he really spent most of his time in solitude in this very small town.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. And I think that's where you could actually start to hear the break in his music too. So he is basically known today for 6 books of madrigals. The first 4 he wrote in Ferrara. So he marries Eleonora d'Este in 1594 and moves to Ferrara. There was a group of women called the Concerto della Donna, who were supposed to be the best singers, and their specialty was the madrigal. So whether it was because he loved Eleonora or because he thought it would be a convenient thing to kind of marry into the family of Alfonso, the Duke of Ferrara, and kind of make his place known at the court there, because Ferrara was essentially the center of musical mannerism at the time. Alfonso would invite all kinds of composers to come and write for his musical forces. So Gesualdo writes 4 books of madrigals in Ferrara while he and Eleonora are living there. Then, after 2 years, Gesualdo, not Eleonora, but Gesualdo moves back to Gesualdo. The final 2 books of madrigals, he doesn't publish until 1611. So we have about 15 years in between the two. You would be hard pressed to think, if you heard a piece from his first book of madrigals and a piece from his 6th book of madrigals, you wouldn't think it was the same composer. So he goes back to Gesualdo after 2 years in Ferrara, and that's where things start to get really, really weird in his life. Because as terrible as it is that he committed this double murder, um, you know, in terms of the law, it wasn't terrible, because someone in his high position could commit double homicide, and the high court doesn't even give him a slap on the wrist because he's a prince and she was cheating on him. But he gets to Gesualdo and you realize, okay, what he did may have been legally okay, but in terms of morally, you know, living with that kind of action on you, you know, has to break you down at some point. Gesualdo's music to me reminds me of Clytemnestra in the Oresteia, where after she and her lover work to kill her husband, Agamemnon, she starts having these terrible nightmares, these terrible visions, and they drive her crazy and she can't sleep anymore. And I think It sounds to me from Gesualdo's music, those last two books of madrigals, that in isolation, in Gesualdo, where he's getting into some kind of aspects of the occult, he's apparently employing young men whose job it is to beat him every day, on top of the fact that he's having to live with the idea that, you know, he slaughtered his first wife and her lover. He was abusive to his second wife. You know, there are a lot of people in classical music who always want to separate the music from the life. And I just don't think, I mean, I don't think you could do that with any composer, but I don't think you could listen to Gesualdo's late music, the works he wrote in the last couple years of his life, and think that there is no relationship to the life he lived and to the havoc that he essentially caused. But also, what's super interesting is the early madrigals, he was setting the poetry of other writers. Whereas in the final two books of madrigals, except for a few isolated instances, he was writing the poetry he was setting. Death, agony, love, ecstasy, pain, those words, if we were to make a pie chart of all of the words in his madrigals, those would be the biggest slices of the pie. So to me, you can't separate the emotional content of those works from the life he was living at the time by any means whatsoever.
That's fascinating. Which period of his writing would you consider the most innovative in terms of him being so far ahead of his time?
Definitely the late works.
When he's weird and miserable and tortured is also when he's at his most innovative.
Absolutely. If you listen to the early books of madrigals that he wrote in Ferrara when he had all of the finest musicians of the Este court, for him, the music is beautiful and it's incredibly well written. And, the poetry is much gentler. And you could tell like maybe he thought he had a new lease on life, new marriage, new inspirations in the Este court. And so he was writing polyphony that in the style and the complexity that had been written in for the decades before he got started, but he took mannerism to the nth degree at the end, in those last two books of madrigals. So he was constantly taking the ear in places not only we didn't expect, but when the music of his gets super weird, we don't necessarily want to go. At certain points, it's kind of like watching a horror film, and it's just like, no, don't open the attic door. No, I don't want to go into there.
It's interesting to think about it from the perspective of a traveler, because this is what I try to do, is try to match these experiences of awe and wonder. When you walk into the historic center of Naples, which is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on earth. So really, the historic center of Naples during the time of Carlo Gesualdo might not look very different from the way it looks today. And when you sort of enter near Piazza Bellini, of course, another famous name associated with music, you pass by the music conservatory. And as you're walking toward what was Gesualdo's palazzo, you hear all the music coming out of the conservatory windows. And sometimes it's, just people warming up or violins, strings warming up. And then other times you hear beautiful music. Although one of my favorites, I was actually staying in an apartment across the street from there, and somebody kept practicing Flight of the Valkyries. You walk this narrow street past the music conservatory, and then there are all these shops, and they're selling sheet music, and a lot of it is antique. And then you come to the San Severo Chapel, which is famous for the Veiled Christ, which is one of the most famous monuments in Naples. That statue, that sculpture wasn't created during Gesualdo's era, but that chapel was. And one of the theories is that that chapel was actually built as an atonement for how vicious his crime was.
Mm-hmm.
He's part of the Spanish dynasty in southern Italy. These are the same folks that brought us the Spanish Inquisition. The toxic masculinity was abundant. These were not shy people to violence and gore. And they, this idea that maybe this chapel was built as an atonement for that is another testament, I think, to what you're saying, which was, even though he didn't serve any time for this crime, it really was quite shocking to society at large, of already violent society. And so it's definitely had to have weighed on him, especially as he got older and spent so much time in isolation.
Definitely. And outside of the madrigals, the only other music of his that we know is two sets of sacred works. And both of them are from that late period as well, in 08 and 1611, I believe. And that music isn't nearly as chromatic and kind of innovative as those late madrigals were. But what's interesting is that he must have been writing them around the time that he had commissioned what's, I think, his only known portrait in his private chapel in the Capuchin monastery that his father had built at Gesualdo. There's no hiding behind the title, The Pardon of Carlo Gesualdo. And so there is this idea of penitence in that after, by that time, 2 decades of living with this, these horrible murders he committed, that in his music, the devotion to his music, he's trying to work out these feelings of pain and sorrow and love and agony, but he's also making time to write a couple sacred works. That one of them is a tenebrae, which is a set of responses during the Mass during Holy Week. So, he's writing music that he envisions will be performed during the holiest of weeks. And why would you do that if you were just someone who just wanted to be in his own castle alone, being beaten every day and writing, emo poetry at the time? So there has to be, some kind of connection to that idea of wanting some kind of absolution, or seeking some kind of absolution. What was going on in these castle walls for 15 years? And all we have as a record is this music that he created.
The castle is interesting. It's massive when you're driving there. The village is up on hill. The GPS always sends you through some complicated side roads to get there, but it's certainly the first thing that you see. And it was heavily, heavily damaged during the 1980 Irpinia earthquake, which devastated the region. Much of it has been rebuilt, and a lot of really good things actually came from that. One of them was money dedicated to restore all of these beautiful monuments, the castle among them. And there's still work going on, but I have seen a performance in the castle, and there are cultural events there all the time. So it really has become a hub in an otherwise very rural place. For somebody who really has no background in music whatsoever, doesn't really know how to listen to this kind of music, what would you recommend as a place to start?
The key to listening to these madrigals is to sit down with the music and the Italian text and an English translation, or whatever translation you need in your language. Because the key to madrigals, especially to madrigals written during the Mannerist period, they were all about text painting. And the poem always came first. So, you could listen to the music without the text and still hear the unsettling nature of the late works. But, especially if, your listeners are equipped with the story and they want to kind of see this story and these horrors and this emotional, place manifested in the music, it's sit down with these late madrigals, and all of the translations are available online. So if you listen to a madrigal from the first book that he wrote in Ferrara, he'll talk about the connection, or the poetry that he'll set, connects love and death, but almost like, oh, death is just this sweet release of love. Whereas you look at book 6, there's one that's really popular, and it says, "Die, alas, in my suffering. And she who could give me life, alas, kills me and will not help me. O sorrowful fate, she who could give me life, alas, gives me death." How you could listen to that, and especially with the wild, grumbly, growly music that he writes for this, and not think of the life that he's lived, the acts that he's committed, is kind of beyond me. Another example is again from book 6. The text is, "Beauty, since you depart, as you take my heart, take also my torments. For a tormented heart could surely feel the pain of death, but a soul without a heart can feel no sorrow." Yeah.
That's deep.
And so these are deep, dark thoughts. And, could imagine him sitting in whatever room in the castle by candlelight, 2 a.m., wounds on his back from being beaten by his, coterie of flagellators early in the day, and putting pen to paper to write these. There's no precedent for the harmonic language that he was working with. So not only was he doling out this autobiography and the poetry that he was writing for these madrigals, but through the music, through the wild harmony, almost his way of saying, no one has ever felt like me in this moment before. He's giving voice to it through music that hadn't been written in the way that he wrote it before.
The power of our phones, right? We can take this music with us and sit there and then pull up the poetry on our phones as well, and like have these mini concerts for audience of one or whoever you're with, and just dive right into these experiences. You don't need to wait for there to be a performance or
Yeah,
anything.
and that's what makes it so interesting when composers in the late 19th and early 20th century were getting into him, is you would really have to go out and try and find these materials.
Yeah.
Not to mention 100 fewer years of research and scholarship around him and everything that we've learned, for the history books in that time. But yeah, now you could sit down and, like I said, if someone had asked me for an example of how can you hear a composer's life story through music, Gesualdo would be in the top 3 of composers that I would say, this is how you do it. You can't miss it. It knocks you right over the head.
Thinking of that castle too, you say castle, he's a prince, of course he's got people waiting on him hand and foot, but it's not a cozy place.
Mhm.
I mean, these castles were, still cold and damp and hard, and there would be people scurrying around to serve you, of course, but still, I mean, our lives, a middle class life in an apartment is still a million times more comfortable than life would be in a Renaissance castle. And then the fact that these towns also too, this area of Italy, Irpinia, was where all of the dukes and nobles and earls and barons all had their country estates, and the villages really acted like their own worlds. And so also, if he were to move around the village to go to the churches, the Capuchin crypt that you mentioned, I mean, everybody would be there like, oh Lord, I serve you. I mean, just everybody, kissing his ass essentially.
Yeah.
I just thought of a funny connection. I made a Tony Soprano joke before, but there were a lot of immigrants from this area that went to Jersey. And Tony
Mm.
Soprano's character, in fact, does say his people were from near Avellino, which is where Gesualdo is from. So there is, in fact,
That's interesting.
a direct link between this area and the Sopranos of New Jersey.
That's so interesting. And it brings up one more point that kind of sets Gesualdo apart, especially in his day, is that most composers at the time were working for a royal court, or they were in service to the church. Gesualdo was incredibly unique in that because of his family wealth and the wealth that and title that he assumed after his father died in 1591, he had no one to ask permission to, or can I write this? Or, how about this? He was able to completely follow his own whim, his own whims when it came to what he wanted to compose, how he wanted to compose. And that's also very unique in that, you know, unlike all of his contemporaries who had someone to be accountable to for the music that they produced, he didn't have anyone to be accountable to. So
Yeah.
he could go off into his drafty, dark castle and write these madrigals because he didn't have to write for money. And that is a very unique instance.
Yeah, when you think about all the musicians that come after that are so famous, like Salieri, Vivaldi, they all were like needing to make money, needing to please their patrons, having
Totally. I mean, you think about Bach. Bach wrote thousands of works, but very few for himself. Mostly they were for the different churches that he was, hired to be the music master at. So he would be writing, music for 52 Sundays per year and, all the other, kind of high holy days. Monteverdi, all of those, cutting edge operas that he wrote were written as part of his job, at the Venetian court. And he had all of, the wealth and the musicians and the resources, the large orchestra that his employers could offer him to create this incredible music. But Gesualdo is, except for the 2 years in Ferrara, is writing in complete isolation. And he's writing only for music for 5 voices. All he needs is 5 singers to be able to hear it, and no one to kind of be beholden to in what he writes. And that's a very rare thing. And also another reason why I don't think you could listen to his music and not hear it as an extension of his life experience, because he's not writing it to please anyone else. He's not writing it to collect a paycheck. He doesn't have to worry about any of that. So what does he want to express as a man in his position who's done the things that he's done and lives in the environment that he lives in?
So, two more questions for you. One, you have an Italian last name. Do you know where your family's from in Italy?
I do. So I am third generation. My great grandparents came to the United States. My great grandmother was from Naples, and my great grandfather was from Sicily, which is very funny because there is a small town in Italy called Cirigliano, and no one in my family is from there.
Somebody was from there at some point, probably.
At some point, they migrated. Yeah, it's funny. Like, people just can't believe, based on like my light complexion, that my family is from southern Italy.
Plenty of blondes in southern Italy. The Normans conquered. There's blue eyes and blonde hair all over the place.
That's true.
And the other thing I wanted to ask you about was that Werner Herzog documentary. My God, I didn't know that it existed. And in fact, my friend who lives in Gesualdo didn't even know about it. And I texted
My
her, and it was
goodness.
probably the middle of the night, like, dude, have you seen this? And she hadn't. And I found it on YouTube. I sent her the link. Do you know anything about it?
It's wild that like more people don't actually know about it. It only makes sense that someone like Werner Herzog would be as deep into the weeds with Gesualdo as he is. But I think anyone who has an interest in kind of this wild, one of a kind story in classical music has to seek it out.
I wasn't sure at first how much he was playing with reality, and then he's telling all these stories with local people. In fact, my friend who lives in Gesualdo said, I know that guy. Documentary was made in 1990. The guy's obviously much older, but she recognized him. And then she's like, I've never heard these stories before. And then I did a little bit more research, and it seems as though he was making stuff up, mostly. Some stuff overlapping, and some stuff was true. But then, of course, you get to hear the music and watch these singers performing, which is so beautiful because it's also just sort of it's throughout the documentary, so you kind of go in and out of the music on this journey.
Yeah, and I think it's very indicative of, you could say he was making things up, but it's just like the way the historical record has come to us, it's very hard to tell what was truth and what was gossip at the time. And there were all kinds of different strands of gossip about how vicious the murders were. At one point, there's a rumor that Maria and Fabrizio had a child, and he had the child hung from a bassinet until it fell. That's probably not true. So I think what Herzog is doing is kind of just showing us, like, where is the actual truth? It's foggy. And
Yeah.
also, the great thing that I love about it too, as you mentioned, there was that terrible earthquake in 1980, 10 years before he made this documentary. So you get that kind of almost kind of bombed out quality to the
Yeah.
castle and to the region that, and I've never been, but I imagine after, 20 years of refurbishing the area, that it actually looks quite different now than it did in Herzog's documentary. It's almost like he made the documentary at a time where it's just like visually the castle in the area is what you would think it looked like when Gesualdo was writing this music, that he would be in kind of like this no man's land, you
Yeah.
know?
And it still feels like that even when you're on your way to Gesualdo. There are some towns that were just too badly damaged or were so sparsely inhabited at the time it wasn't worth restoring them. And there is, like, depending how Google Maps wants to send you, you can drive through this complete ghost village before arriving at Gesualdo. And so
Wild.
still have a lot of those elements in the area. And interesting too about these stories that people are telling, particularly that one where the local man is in the castle and he's telling this terrible story about the baby and the bassinet. The people that would have lived and worked in Gesualdo at the time and have since were, we could say peasants. That sounds like a weird word today, but mostly illiterate people that worked for a landowner and were not educated, but then were at the same time exposed to these things that we consider very highbrow today. So they had a foot in that world. And
Yeah.
in a culture that was all about storytelling, but without writing those stories down, Gesualdo is certainly woven in to the local lore. So that's what I like about the Herzog documentary, is that it probably encompasses a lot of those stories that just get lost when people stop repeating them,
Totally.
but certainly must have been part of the local storytelling until television became ubiquitous in every Italian home.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, for someone who was just seen as, a sinister recluse in his, and especially with Italians, just like we love a bit of drama, we love a good story. It's just like, well, you can't get a more fascinating story than that. And yeah, to think of the people who would have lived at the castle, who didn't know anything about music and, like you said, were illiterate, to just know that this crazy employer, was just writing his music all day, and then when you would hear the music performed, you know, it's that extension of, like, the mysteries around how deep was he into the occult, and the witchcraft trial that he was forced to endure with his mistress, or a couple of his mistresses. It just there's just so many layers.
I learned that during my time at the Met. And there were so many stories that I felt like, wow, this is so great. We should share this. And people being like, well, it's not very serious. I'm like, yeah, but it's interesting. So
Yeah,
let's
totally.
get
And
people.
you're doing everything a terrible disservice by not going into these stories that people are going to find fascinating.
I want to say a big thank you to Michael. He sent me clips of the music paired with the words that you can listen to over at danielleoterry.com. And that's also where you can become a subscriber. It was such a pleasure to collaborate with him, and I really hope this is just the first of many times that he'll be a guest here on this podcast. It was also wonderful to reconnect with him because we actually kind of worked together in the past. We both worked at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I was at the Cloisters, which is the medieval branch, and I had written a blog post for the museum's website. And Michael, who was in the digital department, he had been in charge of doing the editing. So we exchanged a couple of emails, but we never met. Then in 2020, after we had both left the museum, I published an essay about my time at the Cloisters in the Paris Review. Michael read it and remembered me, and because my essay includes a piece of music that becomes the centerpiece of the story, Michael reconnected with me via a link to an article he wrote about the same piece of music for his newsletter, Shades of Blue. You'll also find that linked in the show notes. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate and review it. That's the best way for new people to find my work. I've heard so many people say they've discovered me on Apple Podcasts in particular. So if you can share there, thank you. I truly, truly appreciate it.